Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance. The CFO role is changing rapidly, moving from cost controller to strategic visionary. And with every change comes opportunity. We are here to help you take advantage of this transition, to win at work, drive your career forwards, and lead with confidence. Join Hannah Munro, Managing Director of ITAS, a financial transformation consultancy, as she interviews key experts to give you real-world advice and guidance on how to transform your processes, people, and data. Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance.
Hello everybody and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0, and I'm really excited to say that we're going to be launching a new content series today, and this is episode 1. And joining me today to talk about the wonderful world of private equity, or PE, as you hear me talk about, trying not to use too many acronyms, is Rich Sanders. So Rich is the founder and managing partner of Sullivan Street Partners. So welcome, Rich. Lovely to have you on the show.
Hello, yeah, pleasure to be here. This is great.
So tell me a little bit about, I guess, your journey into private equity.
Yeah, so I actually came through from originally a manufacturing engineering starting point, which is not the first place that you'd perhaps choose to start that private equity journey. But I was an engineer, had a proper job before, then went into advising private equity on the operations of their deals and businesses from, I hate to say, from like 99 onwards. So it's like 25 years, as I was reminded the other day, of being in the sector. But in between times, I've also continued to do bits of proper jobs. So I was strategy director for a couple of years at John Lewis Partnership. And then in 2010, the big step, we founded Sullivan Street Partners. And we set up a business that does investments with an operational focus. And that's hopefully some of the, let's say, wisdom that we've been gleaning for the last 15 years is about how to work collaboratively as a team with our CFOs and the rest of the board to drive results in companies.
And you know, obviously you've worked not just as a founder and managing partner, but also within the world of private equity. So tell us a little bit about the types of private equity that you've seen across the years.
Yeah, look, we have to remember that private equity is still relatively young. So, I mean, in those last 25 years, there was private equity before that, but not much. And there was venture capital in the US that then became private equity in the UK. So we've still got like a long way to go in terms of specializations and those kind of more mature models. But at the moment, there are like 5 or 6 different types of private equity. So the standard one that I've worked with most is leveraged buyout funds. So these are funds that are backing managers with some debt. That's the leverage. They have funds often. So they'll do 12 deals in a fund of varying sizes. And the equity check for each one of those deals will broadly be the same. So it might be 5 million of equity or 10 million of equity or 20 million or 100 million or whatever it might be. So that's a buyout fund. Venture capital tends to be earlier stage. So that will be businesses that, you know, venture capital is often associated with tech businesses that are pre-profit, but it also applies just to small companies that are just fledgling enterprises. So 2-3 people, or they're just starting out on that journey. So venture capital, and the returns from those businesses will look different. You'll have more of those businesses fail than you would in private equity, where it tends to be traditional established businesses. So venture capital is another type. You then have some specialism. So growth equity is an interesting space where of all deal sizes, but often sort of small mid-cap deal sizes, you'll have an investment fund that's focused on an established business that's proven it's got a good proposition, established clients and capabilities, but is about to go through a stage of acceleration. You know, often top line growth. How do you scale? How do you sell more to more people? So that would be growth equity. And again, those businesses can be really agile. Those investment funds, really agile, really focused, lots of sales and marketing support, and that's growth equity. And then some related sectors would be, you know, distressed funds or special interest funds. So that'll be where possibly something's going wrong in a business, and that's where those investors would get involved. So they might be used to working with companies coming out of administration, or stagnating assets. Occasionally we look at those types of deals. So that's like a distressed assets fund. And then a final one that's sort of private equity is mezzanine financing, which is where you're halfway between private equity and bank debt. So you'd expect a higher return than the bank, but you'll often have an individual in there that sits on a board alongside a management team and acts a little bit like an investment director in a private equity fund. So there you go. There's probably lots of other types as well, but I think that's a good starting point for everyone listening to this about how to orient yourself as to how private equity works.
You mentioned these different types of private equity. Tell us a little bit about the internal structures that sit within them. Are they all the same? I guess is my first question.
I think they're all based around broadly the same structure. So we can talk to one structure and I might reflect on a couple of differences at the end. So within a private equity firm, the house that is private equity, you'll have the frontline individuals are the investment directors. So they are the individuals who will go and talk to corporate finance houses to seek deals. They will then talk to the management teams of those deals. They'll talk to the owners of those companies, and they will put together deal opportunities. They will be supported by analysts as well as external advisors. But inside of a private equity firm, you'll normally have a number of advisors. Maybe it's as many as 3 per investment director, something like that. And they together will then work out the investment case based on a business plan. Where is the finance going to come from in terms of debts? What do they think the returns are going to be? All of those types of things. So they're doing that work. They will take that work to the investment committee. The investment committee will often be senior investment directors. So this might be where you have like managing partners of a private equity fund. And sometimes there are external advisors on that investment committee as well. So it can be a committee of the great and the good. And some of these are very large. Some of them are like panel type meetings where you might have 12 people in a room. Some of them are very small, and it might actually be one individual that really makes all of the lead decisions around the risk. There will then be some other specialists floating around. So there'll be some individuals who are supporting, obviously, the working of the private equity house as a firm. So there might be a CFO for the private equity fund. There will be some admin and support for the private equity fund. There's often a legal individual, like sort of a head counsel individual who helps with all the legal documentation. There might be a fund administrator. So you have a back office in a private equity vehicle as well. And then you may have some individuals out there who do things like relationship management across all of a sector, or relationship management across all corporate finance advisors. So they might be, you might class those as rainmakers if you want to give them a glamorous title. There might be some of those. And then there's probably a good number of associates that you can have that maybe they're doing this on a part-time basis, or they're alumni of the private equity fund who also help put deals together and do that type of thing. A relatively new area is actually the value creation teams. And that's something that's really important to us at Sullivan. We do a lot of value creation work. But over, I'd say, the last 10 years, value creation teams have started building up. I think very relevant for any future CFO. And what those teams do is they work with the businesses once they have been bought to improve, whatever aspect they can. So that might be reporting, it might be IT, marketing, sales. There'll be different specialisms within that value creation team, but they're an in-house bunch of like interims and consultants, essentially, that work with those investment directors, deal in and deal out.
Now, you've talked a lot about the investment piece and the structure around that, and you mentioned value creation. Would you still be dealing with the investment team as a CFO once you've been, I guess, purchased or the acquisition has been done, or does that relationship transition to a different team normally?
Yeah, there's no fixed rule, as you might imagine. But I think it's a really good question. Look, if you're part of a management team and you meet an investment director, it's a brilliant question to ask them early on. Like, do you sit on the boards of the businesses that you invest in? Great question. And often that will be the case. but sometimes you'll have different teams out there, rainmaking, finding the deals, to then running them. And sometimes there's just practicalities that get in the way, where they'll be trying to bring someone on. They're trying to give someone an experience of working on a board before they're perhaps in the position to go and seek a new deal, put a new deal together themselves. So just like in any company, there's that dynamic of development, people stretching. So it can be that changes. There will often be some senior oversight that, like, there'll be an investment. So on the investment committee, there'll often be a senior individual who is a kind of first reserve, if you like, for an investment director. And that's another point of continuity between doing the deal and running the company. So in short, often it's the same person, but I think most of the good private equity funds, they'll find some way of there being continuity between doing the deal and running the company.
And I guess you mentioned obviously the different types of CFO, different types of private equity. What would you say what questions would you ask to figure out if there's a particular type of private equity that you're working with? Maybe you're a new CFO coming into role. How would you figure out sort of where they fit within that private equity market?
Yeah, sort of categorizing them, right? Sort of finding their niche. Well, yeah, look, I'd like to say you go and look at their website. I mean, I think you probably do. Sometimes the websites look very similar. But the questions, I think you can categorize private equity investors quite quickly when you look at the size of deal that they'll get involved in. It tells you actually what it is that's likely in terms of the level of support they're giving and how many deals are they sitting on, those types of things. Just because practically, if you're sat across, 8 deals, you can't be taking a very active role in those 8 companies, right? You'll be a board member, you'll be supportive in that role, but you're not going to be doing anything else. If you know that individual is working on 8 small companies, again, you might be able to say, okay, so what's their role there? They're helping those companies start up. They're helping those companies to form so that they can grow. Or like I said about growth capital, it might be that their specialism is revenue growth or something like that. But yeah, look, I think you can ask about size, you can ask sector specialism. Private equity funds will sometimes talk about types of value creation that they specialize in. So if you say, like, how do you invest? What do you tend to do? Some might say, well, we always get involved in price. They'll often get involved in procurement. They'll often definitely get involved in revitalizing finance, nearly all of them. But I think if you ask them that around how do they influence the success of the business, that's a good question. And it sort of leads you to, what type of investor are they?
And I think you alluded to this earlier, but just for clarity, does it vary quite dramatically the level of involvement that different private equity organizations have? And is it dependent on, I guess, the size of the entity they're working with, or the stage or the series of investment they're at? Or is it more about who they are as a private equity house? Is there a general rule of thumb around that?
Yeah, I think with all of these, it varies very much. And so it's a funny thing, but people talk about having experience of worked with private equity. It's not one thing. And I think it's an interesting shorthand that's not all that helpful. Oh, you've got experience in private equity, but which type? So I think, a lot of practicalities get in there. So it varies very much. So in my experience, kind of prior to Sullivan Street, an investment director might turn up, and it's a little unkind, but barely remembering what the business does, right? Because the spread's so thin. And actually their job is not to get involved in the month to month. Their job was to make a good investment at the beginning and a good exit at the end, and to back the management team. And that's a really good model. That's a brilliant model. So that's probably the lightest touch, through to people who are like involved 2 days a week in that specific company. But obviously you can only do that for a certain number of investments, which is why, again, people I've advised going into other investment companies, I've always said to them, ask how many deals that individual is working across. And I'll tell you quite a lot about how much time there's likely to be. But you'll never be treated as stupid for asking that question. That there is nothing you can assume about that role. And to an extent, it varies as well by where you are in your investment cycle, and actually how well the company's doing. Because there's always another deal to do. There's always somebody else that can do with some help. So actually, if your team are doing brilliantly, or you're 2 years away from an exit, it's appropriate actually that the person from the private equity fund maybe has less of an involvement than at other times. So that kind of practicality as well kicks in.
And you said an interesting statement just then, that you'll never be thought of as stupid if you're in a conversation with someone asking that question. What sorts of things, I guess, do private equity investment directors expect business owners and CFOs to know about private equity when they're going into those kind of conversations? Is there an assumption that they don't know anything, or what's the expectation?
Well, yeah, I mean, private equity hasn't got a brilliant reputation for patience. So, and I think advisors would kind of just stoke that up in management teams, particularly, do prepare, you've got to know a lot. I think if you make genuine inquiries, generally, most people I've met in private equity are very human and accessible. But that said, what can you prepare? You should understand the leveraged buyout model. Mm-hmm. All right, and maybe we can talk about that in a second. But how does debt lead to better returns for a private equity investor? It's a really fundamental thing. And I'll be honest, there's some people I've met as directors who've been through a loop of private equity who can't really articulate that. And I think that's something that you should know about, particularly if you're a CFO, because it explains how the bank is going to act, how the private equity investor is going to act, and what the expectations are in terms of your reporting and why that's important. So that's one thing. I think the other would be how the economics work for you as an individual. Like, how do your management schemes work? Because again, if you haven't made your inquiry about that, and there's lots of places you can look that up, and maybe again we can talk about that, then you're maybe not motivated in the right way to be a private equity CEO or a private equity CFO. So I would look at those two things. I wouldn't be particularly damning of people who haven't got that understanding, but it does tell you something. It actually says that this hasn't been a long-term goal if people haven't inquired about those two things.
So, there's two great things for us to talk about there, Richard. You've lined us up beautifully.
Superb segue.
So brilliant. So let's explore the first topic. So you mentioned leverage buyout. Apologies if I got the terminology wrong, but let's talk that through.
Yeah. So I describe that to people in the team here when they first walk in the door as it's like buying a house. So a leveraged purchase is where you're combining a mortgage, so the debt, with your deposit, which is the equity. So, not that many people now have bought their own house. This used to be a great example. But that's essentially what you're doing. So instead of paying, let's say, £100 million for easy numbers to buy a company with all equity, so with my money out of my bank account, what I'm doing is I'm putting in, say, again, for round numbers, 25 million of equity, and the rest is debt. And that means that if the business then ends up being worth, let's say it's £125 million, instead of that being a 25% uplift on the 100 for the equity, if you bought it all with equity, you actually end up doubling your money.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the principle. And obviously, if you go from 100 to 200, you've times 5 your money. That's the type of returns that people will often be looking at. So a leveraged buyout is using debt to maximize the return, and you do that by minimizing the amount of money of your own that you put to work. And it is that simple. But what you've got to think through is, okay, so in the example I've just given, if the business is then worth £75 million, the equity has lost all of their money.
Yeah.
Right. So it's that, slightly higher risk, higher returns, or in some cases, a lot higher risk and higher return. But it's that's what swings the return and makes private equity so lucrative. Even in traditional slow growth markets, you get the right leverage, and you get an upwards growth, you can still win significantly.
One of the hardest things, I think, is actually putting into words what it means to work with myself and the team here at ITAS. Because not only are we a financial transformation consultancy, but we do it using Sage technology. So rather than me tell you how awesome we are, let me introduce one of our customers.
We were very happy to work with ITAS. We were really aligned. And yeah, we would have discussion on how to improve stuff also. And since we are live, really, I'm amazed by the support. They answer really quickly. And if we don't understand each other because like the issue after some emails is not fixed, we can jump on the call, and they are really easy to reach. They respond really quickly. So I feel like it's ongoing collaboration, and it's not like ITAS disappeared after the implementation. So we are really happy to work with ITAS.
And where does private equity get most of its debt funding from? Is there lots of different sources, or is it, particularly traditional sources? Where does it come from?
Yeah, so I think you can simply think about it as from banks, right? But there are lots of different flavors of banks. I mean, again, if we did this talking about the different types of banks, there's like 30, 40 different types of them. But broadly, you go from high street type banks, so like HSBC, Lloyds, those type of people, and they tend to offer, reasonably low interest rates. They won't be interested in some of the more racy sectors, like the risky sectors. But that would be what you class as kind of high street banking debt, through to like the mezzanine funds I mentioned before, where the interest rates are maybe as high as like 20%, 25%, like really racy interest rates. But the reason you might use some of those types of, and there's a lot in between, but the reason you might use some of those is that's still cheaper than the cost of equity. Expectations around a return on an asset can still be higher than that. So it might be rational to take maybe not all of your debt from one of those high interest areas, but a slice of the debt. So in my example of the £100 million, maybe 10 million of it would be mezz at a high interest rate. And that would give you further leverage on top of the rest of the, so the rest of the 65 million being from high street banks. That's often a structure where you have bank debt, higher interest debt, and then the equity.
And I guess that's what drives, when you think of that structure, that drives, I guess, the growth focus, if I use that terminology, within private equity, and the direction that, we always, when you speak to private equity, it's all about the number. It's all about how do we hit the business plan in terms of growth and change.
I think so. What it does, it means standing still isn't an option, because every part of your capital structure has an associated expectation of return. So being static, like doing today's result in a year's time, well, that's a diminishing return. Like you're actually not keeping up the pace. So on the banking debt, maybe that's only a few percentage points above LIBOR, but that's still ticking. On the equity, the expectation might be 30%, 40%.
Yeah.
And actually, for some of the investment directors, they will not get paid anything if they don't hit a certain rate of return. So I think it drives relentlessness around that improvement and growth.
And let's just talk about the expectations. Is there a kind of a level or a benchmark that, every private equity is working to in terms of rate of return? Or is it really varied depending on the investment, the industry, etc.? Is there any kind of industry standard benchmarks that you're working to?
There are some rules of thumb, but as you might expect, it changes quite significantly by sector, investment stage, size of company, and the associated risks with all of those. So, I mean, everyone at heart in making any investment, and this is true of all of us, you're weighing up the risks versus the return. But that said, if you're in a standard small to mid cap private equity house, you'll typically look at a, say, 3 times return. 2 to 3 times return is what you're looking for. And again, with standard leverage, that might mean over 4 or 5 years, double profit, something like that. Okay, so that's not a bad rule of thumb if you don't know any better about where your capital's coming from. And then I think when you look at the risk of your particular sector, you'll see that risk come through in a couple of ways. One, in the valuations that you're likely to get for your company. Because if it's high risk, and unless it's really high growth or something, if it's high risk, it's probably not that attractive. So the valuations will be down on what they might otherwise be. That's one area. But also, if I'm getting involved in a risky sector and I win, it's right that I should expect that to be, disproportionately paid out. I should get a really good return for that. So if you're in a risky sector, I think that's where you start to up those numbers and probably diminish the pool of people who'd be willing to put money to work in those places.
And I guess you mentioned there about the length of the investment, and I've always heard the rule about 4 to 5 years is a typical. Is that true, or are there much longer cycles as well? Like what's the rule of thumb?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're unusual on that at Sullivan Street Partners. So we go deal by deal. We don't have fixed term horizons. We don't have a fund that's telling us you've got to get out of this within 4 or 5 years, or 6, 7 years at the absolute most. We can be in there for a long time. And there are a number of firms like us, like family offices are often like that. And so family office would be, it's a buyout firm, often with leverage, but just working for, one individual estate. So maybe someone who's made some money themselves and then they set up a family office. So those can be really long term. Typically, you're looking at a business plan of 3 years to be delivered and then the company be sold. 4 to 5 years is the number that's given for just, market cycles getting in the way of what would otherwise be a 3-year term. So, I mean, we've all experienced those with COVID and everything else over the last few years. Things get in the way, but a small depression in the market, you wouldn't want to have to go to market at that point. So you'd wait another 12 months and it'd be 4 years. 5 years at a push, most mid-cap, if you've held something for 6 years, something's possibly gone wrong. Right. And they're trying to recover, or they've done something significant, like bought a business in year 3 and they're waiting for that to settle before selling it. But in most funds, when you get to that point, they'll start to become nervous that the fund will need to realize all proceeds, will realize all those investments and get out within like a year or two at the end of that process. So that's why people talk about 4 to 5 years, but in my experience, typically 3. So that's the time period.
Yeah, some fast timeframes to make those returns within. There's no time.
And it's tighter in terms of a management team. So if you've got a 3-year window to be ready to be sold, you've actually got to have done your work in 18 months.
Yeah.
Because then you're seeing it come through, or you're setting yourself up for growth, and the growth has got to come through. And you've got to have 12 months evidence of that. So that drives real sharp focus on first 12, 18 months.
So before we sort of dig into the investment cycle itself, you mentioned when you talk about family, obviously leverage, and we've talked a little bit about how that, and you mentioned and buyout. So just talk a bit about the the terminology that you're using there. So when you say buyout, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, in old language, and some of this now has been sort of blurred a little, but it would be a management buyout. So it would be a management team seeking investment, often from a bank only, to go and do a deal. And the equity we've been talking about historically would have come from the management team, or would have been a loan from the vendor, right?
Yeah.
So that would have been a management buyout. So we still talk about buyouts and buy-ins and bimbos, which is a buy-in management buyout, which is a bit of both.
Oh my God, you're going to have to explain that term, a bimbo. I love that.
Buy-in management buyout. So that's what that is. I mean, that doesn't often happen because that means that you've got to have an incumbent management team comfortable with new people coming in all at the same time. So, I mean, typically you'll get that done, like a private equity firm will manage that. But something like that organized by the management team themselves is now, I think, pretty rare. But buy-ins and management buyouts. But buyout generally is just what you talk about in terms of, it doesn't necessarily involve leverage, but it's just shorthand for, we're seeking a buyout of this situation, a buyout from this vendor. It's used a bit loosely. But leverage, all that talks about is use of debt to maximize your return.
And, we talked about the length of the cycle. So you said 3 years is the ideal, but then let's look at what that means in terms of what needs to be achieved by the management team within that time frame. That's a big acceleration. So deal is done, right? Business plans agreed. What does that 3 years look like?
Yeah, so I mean, so Sullivan Street don't exactly operate like this, but I've seen it plenty of times in other people. So you'll have your first 30 days, first 90 days, first year, and there might be some other points in the middle of that. And a business plan when you first go into the company of 3 years minimum. It may be even 5 years, depending on the industry. I think within that first 30 days, there will be a huge amount of getting reporting working. Right? There may be lots of other things going on as well. There might be some gaps in the management team that need to be filled. There may be some, and that's because some people might not have bought in to the acquisition. They might have exited at the point of the sale, or actually you just need some people in order to scale up. But actually one of the biggest things is actually getting the reporting and the relationship working with the private equity fund, so that they can see, the private equity fund can see the inner workings of the business writ large on a weekly or monthly basis, so that you can have an effective discussion at the board. But also, governance has been well established, and they feel comfortable that their money is safe, or if there are problems coming, they can see them. So that first 30 days, I think, absolutely essential for that. And also, in our experience, it's setting up communications more widely. So you'll often inherit a business where, maybe there isn't an operating board. The company itself does not get together and meet very often. Or they've often had a period of 12 months preparing for a sale, and they've dropped some of the disciplines around, weekly communication out from the CEO. You have to fix that really quickly, because if you do not have effective cascading communication, you won't be able to move as fast as if you do. So that is an early piece of the jigsaw that you have to put in place. That's often done by CEO and CFO rather than the private equity fund, but it's still a really key first stage. And then I think it's down to what's the value creation plan. And the value creation plan, I mean, an amount of that will be started in the first 30 days, but that's really the first 100 days. So if you are going on a buy and build, so buy the first platform business and then build, and the assumption there is by acquiring more companies. So that's an M&A, mergers and acquisitions led strategy. Well, in that first 100 days, you have to get out and talk to the market about who's for sale. You have to prepare all departments to be able to take on new companies. So all of these shared service and back office have to be ready. And you also have to get your capital ready to invest, to be able to go and do that. So that, as is obvious, can take up quite a lot of the first 100 days, and you might not be done by the end of the 100 days. You have to go at that fast. If that's the plan, and typically, again, you've got an 18-month window, or maybe it's 2 years. If you haven't got to the point where you can do a transaction, say after 6 months, you're running out of time.
Yeah.
You're running out of time. So pricing, that might be another value creation play. Change of the proposition. So again, you'd want to sort out what are you doing in the first 3 months, and then you can put that into practice over perhaps the first 12. But you have to make those changes, and it is that quick.
And you mentioned different types of strategies. You mentioned pricing and M&A. Are there any other sort of commonly known strategies where you could say, "Oh, this investment is doing this kind of strategy"? Is there a categorization of sorts?
Yeah. So look, you start with one that I think private equity is somewhat famous for, and that's reduction of costs.
Yeah.
So and again, a CFO particularly important in this, where you look at where is the business currently spending its money, and is that aligned with the strategy? And just because you've just reset the strategy, just for that reason alone, there will be some differences between what's optimal and where the company is. But often you inherit a thought from 5 years ago will no longer be relevant. Why are we taking that subscribed license or that service? We don't need it. And why have we got 10 people doing business development? Should that be 15? Should it be 5? I mean, again, at the beginning stage of a business, but that's probably pre-investment. Those thoughts should have been pushed through. So look, I think we shouldn't shy away from that. That's a very important process that you have to run through. But often what you do with those proceeds, say you have saved some money, is that you then invest it in other things. So pricing, procurement, improvement of proposition, the marketing of a company. Again, I think if you're going into a growth phase, if you're a traditional business, there are nearly always some experiments you should run in marketing just to see if a different way gains different types of customers. I think a common strategy we deploy is service expansion. That's where you're looking at your client base and inquiring as to, well, what's the next thing that would be most useful?
Yes.
And you add that in. And if you can do that organically, that can be incredibly lucrative because you're already selling to that market. And so you cross-sell that extra service and off you go. That can fuel a huge amount of profit improvement and growth. So we do those types of things. I think you can look at changing the business model, insourcing, outsourcing. You can change commission models for staff and incentives. And the list goes on. I mean, we Sullivan Street, we have a list of about 60 interventions that we will regularly use. And others might have a shorter list, but it just tells you the range of things you can do because it's business, right? It's very varied.
Yeah, but you should know how, if so one of the questions maybe to think about as a CFO coming into a new private equity backed organization is understanding, I guess, their strategy for interventions. What were they planning on doing when they purchased that investment to actually drive that return?
Absolutely. And I think that's right. And again, don't assume that what you're hearing from the rest of the management team is exactly what the private equity fund, thought they were doing when they bought the business, if you're coming in after that point, or would ideally have happening right there and then. If you're replacing a CFO, there's a reason something's gone a little bit wrong, right? Because that predecessor hasn't worked out. So are they happy with the reporting? Have they got to the bottom of pricing? I mean, pricing is a brilliant area for a CFO to get involved in. Procurement, another great area. Systems and IT. Again, there's lots of things where you can enable a lot of next steps. But start by inquiring as to, what was that plan when you invested and how has that changed?
Yeah. And that's a really interesting piece because I think, there is a rightly or wrongly deserved view that private equity, CFOs either last a long time or they don't last very long at all. So let's talk about, maybe, I guess, the expectations that private equity have of a CFO and investment. What does good look like?
Yeah, well, when I interview CFOs, there are some things that you've got to have, right? So, and again, I've said that private equity is many and varied, but these are core capabilities, I think, to most of these environments. So the ability to communicate the performance of the business is critical. And if you've got 10 priorities, I don't know, it might be the top 3. Because actually, if you can't get past that, the private equity fund has got a fundamental problem in that it can't look into the business and be confident of what's going on. They can't be confident that the management team understand what's going on and doing the right things. So almost especially if it's a hands-off fund, that this reporting element is critical. But if you're a hands-on fund, it's also critical. You might just want to get into some operational KPIs as well. So cannot overstate how important that is. So when I'm articulating that, a CFO needs to talk about, well, what KPIs have you brought in before? How do you look at, in a prior business, how did you look at performance? What were your lead indicators that there might be a problem? How are you lining up your risk management with your reporting? Because really what you want the CFO to do is to be the early warning system to you and to set up the dashboard that also tells you whether something's going wrong. So look, that is a key theme, cannot overstate it. I think then CFOs are expected to be more than finance, right? So perhaps an interesting second place to go would be, what else are you going to do to drive the growth of the business? Right. So there will be an assumption you're going to get finance working. You're going to get invoices being paid. You're going to sort of manage the cash. You're going to have treasury capability. Of course, you're going to do all of that. So you might not get too many questions about that. You might then get questions around, so have you got an experience of IT systems? Have you automated? Have you been able to take costs out of back office functions in the past? So again, we all like slightly resent some of those costs. We like to be able to do, like when you're growing a business, you'd love to be able to keep your overhead exactly flat, right? So that those are important. But how are you going to do that? Through IT? If you've got experience in HR, and then a kind of third area I'd come to is the ability to execute and integrate secondary acquisitions. So, and I think this is something that's available to a lot of finance directors as they move towards being a CFO. Getting experience at that, I think, helps you for the whole of private equity, but especially in the phase that we're in at the moment, there is a huge number of investment strategies at the moment that hinge on buy and build. And as a CFO, if you do not have integration experience, that's a problem. So it's not definitely a no, but it's definitely not helpful.
No, and there's so much within that. And I'm very excited to say for all of our listeners that we actually have a series of podcasts, because I knew that after speaking to Rich that I would not be able to cover everything I wanted to ask him in one session. So thank you. So we're going to take a pause here, guys. And this is just a sneak peek of the future episodes. So today we've covered obviously the world of private equity. What does it look like? Who are the key players? What are they trying to achieve, and what's the expectation? And then we're going to, and the next few episodes, we're going to explore the role of the CFO for private equity. What does good look like, and what does that mean for you and your experience? And also, how do you get into private equity? We've already talked about some of these key skills, and how do we apply that in? So thank you so much, Rich, for the very first episode. I think you've whetted everybody's appetite for the next one. And yeah, looking forward to exploring this topic more with you.
Brilliant. There's plenty to cover.
Hey Google, what's the best accounting software for my business? Give it a couple of years, and I bet you she'll be able to answer you pretty accurately. But for now, it's still one of the few questions Google can't give you an answer for. But we can. Take our free quiz and find out which Sage product is the right fit for your business. Just head to itassolutions.co.uk.